Let's look at some rational inequalities. Rational inequalities. So we call it inequality because of these inequality signs, the less thans and the greater thans. And the word rational is referring to the type of functions here, the fractions with the x plus 1 over the x minus 2, etc. So the easiest way to explain this would be through an example. So I'm going to do question 1 here for you. So let's have a look at question 1. X plus 1 over x minus 2 is less than 2. So x plus 1 over x minus 2 is less than 2. Okay, so usually what I like to do at this stage is ask my students, what's my next step? And the answer I most commonly get is your next step is to multiply both sides by x minus 2. So let's just have a look at this. All right, so if I have x plus 1 over x minus 2 is less than 2. As I said, a lot of people tell me the next step is to multiply both sides by x minus 2. So let's do that and have a look. So if I multiply the left-hand side by x minus 2, it will cancel here, leave me with just x plus 1. The right-hand side will be 2 times x minus 2. And what about the inequality sign? Well, remember from quadratic inequalities and from linear inequalities, if you multiply by a negative, you change the direction of the inequality sign from a less than to a greater than, or vice versa if you multiply by a negative. So if you multiply by a negative, you change the direction of the inequality sign. So the next question I would ask you is, we multiplied both sides by x minus 2. Is x minus 2 positive or is x minus 2 negative? We need to know this because we need to know, are we looking at a less than or are we looking at a greater than sign on the next line? So is x minus 2 positive or negative? We have to know this. And we don't know what x is. So if we don't know what x is, we don't know if x is positive or negative. Therefore, we don't know if x minus 2 is positive or negative. So unfortunately, we cannot simply multiply both sides by x minus 2 like we did here, because we do not know if x minus 2 is positive or negative. So what do we do? So what we're going to do is we're going to multiply both sides by x minus 2 squared, because at least we know that that is positive. In an inequality, if you multiply across by a value, you have to know if that value is positive or negative. All right. So in this case, we multiply both sides by x minus 2 squared because anything squared is positive, and we know this is a positive value then. All right. So continuing on here, on the left-hand side, this x plus 1 is being divided by x minus 2 and multiplied by x minus 2 squared. So this x minus 2 in the division will cancel with one of the ones in the squared. So my next line will be x plus 1 times x minus 2 less than 2 times x minus 2 squared. So then it's just a case of multiplying it out and tidying it up really. So we've got x squared minus 2x plus 1x minus 2 less than 2 times an x minus 2 squared. We can go to our rough work to do x minus 2 squared. So x minus 2 squared we know is x minus 2 times itself. So that's going to be x squared minus 2x plus 4. In other words, x squared minus 4x plus 4. So x minus 2 squared, we can see, is x squared minus 4x plus 4. And continuing on. So we've got x squared minus 1x minus 2 less than 2 times 2x squared minus 8x plus 8. Everything on the left-hand side, x squared minus 2x squared minus 1x plus 8x minus 2 minus 8 is less than 0. All right. So we'll just continue this on the next page. So we've got x squared minus 2x minus 1x plus 8x plus 2 minus 8 less than 0. So what does that give me? Minus x squared plus 7x minus 10 is less than 0. So this is a quadratic inequality, but as I told you in the video on quadratic inequalities, we don't like starting with a negative x squared, so we're going to multiply the whole line by minus 1 to change the sign. So we're going to have x squared minus 7x plus 10 is greater than 0. Remember, because we multiplied by a negative, the direction of the inequality changed here. So you can see we changed the direction of the inequality sign because we multiplied by a negative. Right, so this is very familiar for us. Now this is another quadratic inequality. So remember quadratic inequalities? We have some region of the graph that we care about. So we care about where this function is greater than 0. So we care about this part of it here, which is the values outside the two roots. So we care about the x values outside the roots of this quadratic. Now the thing to remember is that in this quadratic, we need to know what the roots are. So that's my next step. Let's figure out what the roots are. So remember to find the roots, you're putting the function equals to 0. So we've got x squared minus 7x plus 10 equals 0. And we'll factorize that. So we've got x minus 5 is 0, x equals 5. Or x minus 2 is 0, x equals 2. So we found our roots at 5 and at 2. So x equals 5, x equals 2, they're our roots. So this here must be 2, and this here must be 5. So what is the answer to the inequality then? So we have converted it to a quadratic inequality, and the answer, the x values we care about, are these x values here and these x values here. So what are those x values? Well, these x values on the left, they're the x values that are less than 2, comma. These x values on the right are the x values that are greater than 5. So as you can see, what we did here was we took our rational inequality and we had to multiply both sides by the denominator squared in this case, because we did not know if the denominator was negative or positive. So we had to square it to be sure that it was positive. So we were sure that this inequality sign stayed facing the same direction. After this, it was just a case of multiplying it all out and being tidy. And we converted it into a quadratic inequality that you see here. So once we have a quadratic inequality, this should be familiar for most of us. We just drew our graph, figured out our roots, and once we had our roots, we could identify the region. This quadratic function would be greater than 0 when x was greater than 5 and when x was less than 2. So that is rational inequalities. The best thing for you guys to do now is, maybe practice some of these questions on the sheet, check your solutions, and for access to questions, solutions, graded quizzes, and more, visit www.limymaths.com.